Hi everyone, I'm Bethany, and thank you so much for checking out my project. Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis is one of the key components of his broader theory of second language acquisition, or SLA. Stephen Krashen is an American linguist and educational researcher. He introduced his monitor theory of second language acquisition, also called SLA, in the late 70s and early 80s. Within this theory, the input hypothesis is one of the 5 main hypotheses that make up his overall model. The input hypothesis emphasizes understanding meaning in the input we receive rather than focusing on explicit grammar rules or output like speaking and writing. According to Krashen, language acquisition happens naturally through meaningful communication, not through memorizing or drilling grammar. This hypothesis is one of 5 that make up Krashen's monitor theory, which includes the acquisition learning hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, the natural order hypothesis, this input hypothesis that we're exploring today, and the affective filter hypothesis. Much research has influenced his hypotheses. Noam Chomsky's linguist theory. Krashen was heavily influenced by Noam Chomsky's belief that humans are biologically equipped with an innate ability to acquire language. Chomsky's distinction between competence, what we know, and performance, how we use it, helped Krashen draw his own line between language acquisition in the subconscious and language learning, conscious. This became the foundation of his theory. The next is the first language acquisition theory. Research on how children learn their first language showed that they do so through exposure to comprehensible input, hearing language in meaningful contexts, rather than formal instruction. Krashen applied this same idea to second language learning, arguing that understanding language in context leads naturally to acquisition. The monitor theory also influenced his ideas. Krashen's broader theory includes 5 hypotheses, with the input hypothesis at the center. It builds on the idea that language develops when learners are exposed to input that is just slightly beyond their current ability, what he called I+1. We'll explore this concept a little later. When Krashen collaborated with Tracy Terrell, they developed the natural approach, a teaching method emphasizing communication and comprehension over grammar drills. This approach strongly reinforced the importance of meaningful input. Another area that influenced his work was humanistic education and affective factors. Krashen was influenced by humanistic psychologists like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Their work inspired his concept of the affective filter, which suggests that factors like anxiety, motivation, and self-confidence can affect how well a learner processes input. In short, the more relaxed and confident a learner feels, the more effectively they acquire language. Finally, Krashen rejected behaviorist theories like B.F. Skinner's idea that language is learned through imitation and reinforcement. He argued that these models couldn't explain the creative, generative nature of human language. So, as we can see, Krashen's input hypothesis didn't appear out of nowhere. It was shaped by many different linguistic, psychological, and educational influences. Now that we've explored the background and influences behind Krashen's ideas, let's take a closer look at the core principles of the input hypothesis itself. Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis is a central part of his monitor theory of second language acquisition. The core idea is that learners acquire language most effectively when they are exposed to language input that is comprehensible, but also just a little beyond their current level competence, what Krashen famously called I+1. Let's take a closer look. I+1. Language acquisition happens when learners understand input that contains grammar or vocabulary that's just slightly beyond what they already know. Here, I represents the learner's current level, and the +1 represents the next step up, the slightly more complex language that helps them grow. Learners don't need to understand every single word, just enough to grasp the overall meaning. Krashen makes a key distinction between acquisition and learning. Acquisition is a subconscious, natural process, the same way children acquire their first language. Learning, on the other hand, is conscious. It involves studying grammar rules and language structures. According to Krashen, it's comprehensible input that drives true acquisition, not memorizing rules or doing grammar drills. 3. The silent period is normal. Another important principle is that learners experience a silent period, a stage where they don't understand a lot of language they hear they understand a lot of the language they hear, but they don't yet feel ready to speak. This is completely normal and not a sign of failure. It's actually a natural part of language development, just like how children listen and understand before they begin to talk. Krashen also emphasizes that understanding always comes before speaking or writing. Once learners have built a strong foundation of comprehension through input, their ability to produce language will develop naturally. Trying to force speaking too early can actually slow down real acquisition. Finally, Krashen's affective filter hypothesis ties into this idea. Emotional factors like motivation, anxiety, and self-confidence can influence how much input a learner can actually process. When learners feel relaxed, confident, and motivated, meaning they have a low affective filter, more input gets through and language acquisition becomes more effective. So in summary, Krashen's input hypothesis tells us that understanding meaningful language input in a low-stress, supportive environment is the key to acquiring a new language naturally. Now that we've explored Krashen's input hypothesis and its core principles, let's take a look at some of the main critiques and debates surrounding it. Stephen Krashen's theory has been incredibly influential in the fields of second language acquisition and early English language teaching. However, it's also been widely debated, and especially when it comes to how well it works in the real classroom settings. One of the most common critiques is that Krashen places almost too much importance on input, listening and reading, and downplays the value of output, or producing language through speaking and writing. Researcher Meryl Swain, for example, proposed the output hypothesis, which argues that speaking helps learners notice gaps in their knowledge, process grammar more deeply, and internalize the language better. In the classroom, this means English language learners benefit not only from exposure to input, but also from structured opportunities to speak and write. Another critique is that the idea of I+1 sounds great in theory, but it is very difficult to measure or apply in practice. Teachers often struggle to determine what each learner's current level, or I, actually is, and what the +1 should look like for them. This makes the concept challenging to use in real-world classroom instruction. Krashen also minimizes the role of explicit grammar teaching, suggesting it's mainly useful for editing through the monitor process. However, many studies have shown that direct grammar instruction, especially in academic contexts, can actually accelerate language development. For English language learners, particularly older students or those preparing for academic writing and tests, explicit instruction can be essential. Another concern is that Krashen's theory is based largely on how children naturally acquire language. Adult learners, however, often don't have the same time, environment, or level of immersion to learn this way. In school settings, ELLs face academic demands, time limits, and testing, conditions that differ greatly from natural language environments. Some critics also argue that relying too heavily on natural exposure can actually slow down language development. Learners may understand a lot of input, but without feedback or correction, they might continue making the same mistakes, what's called fossilization. Structured guidance and feedback are often needed to move learners beyond this plateau. While Krashen's ideas are logically consistent and influential, some researchers also argue that the theory lacks strong empirical evidence. They claim it's more of a philosophical framework than a scientifically testable model, especially when studied under controlled research conditions. Finally, critics point out that comprehensible input alone might not be enough for developing academic language, the concept vocabulary, grammar, and discourse needed for success in school. ELLs often need explicit scaffolding, structured practice, and support to reach grade level proficiency in English. So while Krashen's input hypothesis revolutionized how we think about language teaching by emphasizing meaningful exposure and natural acquisition, it isn't always sufficient on its own. In modern classrooms, especially when teaching English language learners, a balanced approach works best, one that combines input, output, explicit instruction, and constructive feedback. Now that we've talked about the theory and the critiques, let's take a look at how Krashen's input hypothesis can actually be applied in the classroom. This part of the presentation is meant to help you see what the theory looks like in action, how teachers can design lessons that reflect Krashen's ideas and help English language learners, or ELLs, acquire language naturally through comprehensible input. So here's what each part of the theory might look like in real teaching situations. I+1. Present input that's just beyond the student's current level, but with plenty of support through visuals, gestures, and context. Comprehensible input. Give students language that they can mostly understand. They don't need to know every word, just the meaning. Natural acquisition. Focus on understanding meaning, not drilling in grammar rules. Silent period is respected. Don't force students to speak before they're ready. Low affective filter. Create a safe and relaxed environment that encourages participation and confidence. Let's walk through one classroom example that demonstrates Krashen's input hypothesis in action. Consider having a beginner to intermediate ELLs, and the focus skills will be listening and reading with the option of speaking and writing. And the goal will be to help students acquire new vocabulary and grammar naturally through meaningful input. The materials we would need are a sequence of pictures like a shortcut cartoon or a comic strip with no words, simple sentence strips with new vocabulary, visuals, real objects, gestures, and body language. At first, we want to activate prior knowledge and scaffold the I. Start by showing one picture from the story and ask simple yes, no, either or questions like, is this a boy or a girl? Is she happy? Use gestures and facial expressions to help them understand. This connects to the student's current level, their I. Next, introduce the story. Add the +1. Tell a short, simple story using present tense and visuals. For example, the girl wakes up. She is tired. She looks at the clock. It is 8 o'clock. She says, "Oh no!" You pause, point, and gesture as you go, introducing new words like wakes up or clock. This is the +1, new language, but still understandable. Next, check for understanding. Keep it input focused. Ask comprehension questions such as, what time is it? Or why does she say, oh no? Students can respond verbally, with gestures, or even by pointing to pictures. The focus here is still on understanding, not perfect grammar. Next, the optional output, if ready. When students feel comfortable, invite them to retell the story using the pictures. Lower level students might match sentence strips to images, while higher level students can write or say the story in their own words. This encourages natural, low pressure output after plenty of input. Some ideas for how to follow up with differentiated options would be, you could adapt it by telling the same story later and introducing the past tense, she woke up. Or add a missing picture task where students describe what's missing. Each version builds upon input and keeps the learning meaningful. This activity ties directly back to Krashen's ideas. I+1, students hear familiar language plus a few new words. Comprehensible input, they're supported with visuals and gestures. The silent period, speaking is totally optional. Natural acquisition, focusing on meaning and not correcting grammar. And low affective filter, it's fun, visual, and low stress. So Krashen's input hypothesis doesn't mean that students just sit and listen passively. It means giving them rich, supported, and meaningful exposure to language that's just beyond their current level through stories, visuals, conversations, and authentic interaction. In practice, it's about creating a classroom where students can acquire language naturally, confidently, and at their own pace. Thank you very much for your time and for checking out my project. Please consider the following as you reflect on what we explored today. Comprehension question. According to Krashen's input hypothesis, what does he mean by the I+1 in his output hypothesis? Feedback. What suggestions or questions do you have for improving this presentation? Thank you so much for listening. I hope this gave you a clearer picture of Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis, not just as a theory, but as something we can see and apply meaningfully in real classrooms. I look forward to checking out your thoughts in our classroom posts. Please feel free to explore the references I use for this presentation on the final slide. Thank you.